Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. It's been a little while since we last talked about Raymond Benson's James Bond series on the channel, partly because there's just been so much going on in the world of 007 these last few months, including from Raymond Benson himself. His Felix Leiter-centric novel The Hook and the Eye has been released digitally, and you can check out a video on my initial thoughts based on reading the first few chapters from a little while ago, and I will have a full video talking about the full book around about the time that the physical paperback is going to get released. But also, because as I mentioned in my last Raymond Benson video, Double Shot, I was enjoying these books so much that I kind of blasted ahead reading them, and I've actually gone back and reread Double Shot, Never Dream of Dying, and The Man with the Red Tattoo at this point. And with Never Dream of Dying, I'm really, really glad that I did revisit it, because I came away on the second time with a very different impression, and a very different feeling, and I'm going to get into why in a little bit, but first let's talk about the plot in some broad strokes. Never Dream of Dying was released in 2001 and is the final story in Raymond Benson's Union trilogy, which sees Bond on the trail of the villainous organization itself. The book opens with a both explosive and quite harrowing chapter in which Bond and Mathis are part of a police raid at a film studio in Nice. They believe that the Union are using the studio as a cover for arms smuggling. There's a pretty large-scale bit of action here in which Bond's actions lead to the deaths of several innocent civilians. He does what he has to do in order to prevent the escape of some Union killers, but it's a pretty shocking way to open the book. As a result of the failed raid, 19 people died inside the destroyed soundstage, including 2 women and an 8-year-old child actress. At least 20 others were injured, some seriously. They were all innocent professionals working on the television film. Actors, technicians, stagehands, designers, grips. James Bond was recalled to London. SIS was formally ordered by DGSE to back off. They would handle the case and keep other agencies informed from then on. Bond not only understood the firm's embarrassment, but he shared much of the guilt. Over the next few nights, he relived his shooting at the petrol barrels in his dreams. Each time he lifted the gun and aimed at those barrels, an inner voice warned him that lives would be lost, and each time Bond ignored the warning and squeezed the trigger. The noise of the explosion was always overshadowed by the screams of the people inside the soundstage. The cacophony of horror and death never failed to wake him with a jolt. Bond was quite accustomed to guilt. It was part of his profession. In his business, people lived or they died. It was that simple. His actions always had consequences, and bearing the weight of those repercussions was just another part of the job. The trick was learning to live with it. So Bond is recalled to London, and there's mention made of how the situation is very embarrassing for MI6, of course. The French intelligence agency told him to back off, and Mathis is given a suspension, but otherwise Bond isn't sacked or anything, and the next time we pick up with him, he's gotten himself into a much better physical and mental state than he was in the previous book, Double Shot, and the incident at the movie studio is certainly not forgotten about. It haunts Bond for sure, but not too much that it becomes overbearing on the narrative. I think a pretty fine balance is struck in that regard. But yeah, I've kind of glossed over the fact at this point that, yeah, Rene Mathis is back, which is really cool. He's very keen on finding the Union and finding the guy at the head of the Union, Legeron, of course. And for a good few chapters, we actually see Mathis carrying out the investigation. The narrative does switch around quite a bit between different characters in this one, and yeah, there's a good chunk of it following Mathis himself. But yeah, I really enjoyed Mathis being back in such a big way, and I never really thought I would be, to be honest. I did have to remind myself, like, other than Casino Royale, which of the Ian Fleming novels Mathis was in, but he was in a handful of them, and it's, yeah, like I say, it's cool having him back in this fashion, and I was really into the chapters where he's, you know, leading the investigation. So, Mr. Benson, if you're watching this, you've done the Felix Leiter spin-off. When are we getting the Rene Mathis spin-off? Because I'd be quite excited about that. Anyway, a pretty major theme flavor of this adventure is, yeah, movie making. Bond is posing as a journalist throughout a good chunk of the story, and he is on movie sets, and he is dealing with people who are involved in movie making, and as a pretty big film buff myself, I was really enjoying all of this. I have a real soft spot for, like, movies about movies, stories about movies, like The Disaster Artist, the book I really loved, movies like Saving Mr. Banks, Hitchcock, Bowfinger, that's another one that I really love. So having a James Bond story taking place in this space is something that rather tickles my fancy. So in terms of why Bond is suddenly thrust into this world, so he's following the clues to try to get to the head of the Union, of course. Nadir Yassassin is back from the previous story, and members of the Union have this identifying marker, given, you know, similar to like how Spectre agents have the ring with the octopus on. The Union are a bit more subtle with their markers, and they have tattoos placed like on their retinas, which are imperceptible to the naked eye, but Q Branch give Bond a certain gadget so that when he's up close and he looks through it, he can see if the eyes are marked or not. So yeah, Bond is following the trail, and he comes to discover that this tattoo was placed in the retina of a man named Leon Essinger. And this is one of the lines that introduces Essinger into the story, which I think is just kind of perfect in summing up what kind of man he is. The cocaine burned the inside of his nostrils as Leon Essinger snorted and jerked his head back to savor the full effects of the drug. So he's this, like, quite sleazy director-producer type, and he was sort of making a name for himself in Hollywood, but there was an incident on one of his sets, and now he has found himself in France, kind of as an exile. He has now gotten himself mixed up with the Union and is doing some work for them. There are several other villains in the course of this story, some with more of a higher rank, higher authority than Essinger, Legerant, of course, and then there's another pretty major villain, which we're going to talk about in the spoilers section. Don't worry, I'll give prior warning when we get there. But I think when I think back on this book years from now, I do think that I'm going to think of this one with Leon Essinger as the main villain. Or at least it was Essinger that made the biggest impression on me over the course of the story. I just thought he was a terrifically despicable villain, and just so slimy, this movie producer type being in league with a villainous organization, I thought was an awful lot of fun. The main Bond girl of the story is also very much from the world of movies and comes in the form of Essinger's estranged wife, Tylin Mignon, named after her father's favourite kind of steak, perhaps. Tylin is easily one of my favourite, she's my favourite Bond girl of the Raymond Benson era so far, and one of my, like, top 5 favourite Bond women in any of these books. I really got into this character. She's this model actress, and she's quite famous, and, you know, Bond is out with her, and paparazzi are taking snaps, people are coming up for autographs and what have you. She has a real warmth to her, and I love the chapter where Bond gets to interview her. He's posing as a journalist, and he seems to really connect with her in terms of humour. He has a passage that I really liked. She ate like a man, Bond thought. She wasn't dainty at all, but all she had to do to retain her femininity was blink those lovely eyes with the deliciously long lashes, lick her lips when she was tasting something, and smile, which she did a lot. In fact, she laughed quite a bit, and Bond liked that. It seemed that everything amused this girl. She was damned attractive. And indeed, she is a woman that Bond very much falls for over the course of this story, which I really liked. I did have some issues in the John Gardner series of books. Like, it did hit a point where it felt like literally every single, like, Bond girl in the story Bond was, like, falling in love with, and, like, Tracy was getting invoked, like, you know, every single book, to the point that it kind of lost its meaning. Flicker being the exception there. I did really like that character in the John Gardner era. I think Raymond Benson's been far more selective and specific when it comes to how Bond is feeling about these ladies, and him falling for Tylin makes complete sense. I really do buy it, and I really love this character. And then I just like the whole complicated element of it, in that she is Essinger's estranged wife. Essinger is also the villain that Bond is investigating. Tylin and Essinger have this sort of agreement where they're keeping up appearances that they're still married for the sake of the film that they are both working on, but their marriage is pretty much over, and, you get the sense that Essinger would kind of, keep it going if it were up to him, but she's done, and the fact that Bond enters into things, and then it just creates that extra dimension of rivalry, I guess, or just antagonism between him and Essinger. I really enjoyed that whole element of the story. Another element that I really liked, there's a sort of a flavour of mysticism that recurs throughout the story, which I thought worked really well. As the title suggests, dreams factor into things at a few points, including there are some recurring dreams that Legerant is having where he is a wolf and James Bond is a stag, bag, and he's chasing him in his dreams. He is a blind character, of course, later on, and he has sight, he has vision in the dreams, and he's chasing this figure that represents Bond. I quite like it when Bond stories like slightly just dip their toes into. It never becomes like magical fantasy, anything like that, but much like Live and Let Die kind of did. You Only Live Twice still stands. There's that moment where Bond like thinks he sees a statue move, which I always really like, and it's just that hint of something. That there maybe is something else going on that I do quite like. It never becomes like overbearing, as I say. It never goes into complete fantasy territory, but there's just enough of a flavor that I think it can add a lot. All the dream stuff really ties into a wider theme. Eyes and vision and perception is a bit of a recurring theme throughout the book. There's this really fantastic torture sequence in the story involving eyes, which just had me like, I've got a bit of a squeamish thing about eyes anyway, and it's this method of torture by which they make the victim blind, but slowly and painfully, and it's just, there are some, bits in this that I thought were really effective, really had me squirming on the tube when I was reading this on my commute. There's also another bit in here, along a similar lines. There's a bit where Bond is in captivity, and it's one of those situations where, okay, how's he gonna get out of this kind of thing? And all he really seems to have access to in this cell is a rat. And it leads to one of the gnarliest and craziest Bond escapes that I've come across in any Bond book or any Bond media. It was shockingly brilliant, and made me think, Diamonds Are Forever would be a quite different film if Bond utilized that same method when he encountered a rat in a sticky situation that he needed to escape from. Okay, so it's time to get into the spoilers. As ever, if you have not read the book, I would highly recommend you do so. So go seek out a copy, and then once you've read the book, come back for the rest of the video. Just to give something of a spoiler-free, premature conclusion, though, at this point in the video, I do want to say that when I do eventually come to ranking all of the Raymond Benson Bond books in terms of how much I enjoyed them, this one will be ranking highly. I really did love this read, and to be honest, I mean, I can't recommend enough reading through the entire Union trilogy, but anyway, into the spoiler talk. Okay, so earlier on I mentioned how I was glad that I came to Never Dream of Dying for a second time, because there was something that I needed to let go of, I think, in order to truly enjoy where the story ends up, where the plot ends up, and that is regarding the villain's ultimate scheme. Bearing in mind that I'm coming to this story knowing that it is the last installment of the Union trilogy, and I'm expecting, big finale kind of. I've really loved the villain's plots in the previous two installments of the trilogy, especially in High Time to Kill, so I came into Never Dream of Dying sort of wondering, oh goodness, it's the climax of this, this villainous organization, what could they possibly come up with? And Lord knows I have every sympathy with any Bond writer that has to come up with these big villain schemes, because, once the globe has been held to ransom with nuclear bombs, where do you go from there? Where can it escalate to? So yeah, I came into this kind of wondering, okay, well, what is going to be the grand finale of the Union's schemes? And ultimately it comes down to, there's this Japanese billionaire called Goro Yoshida, who I will talk about more in the next book, because he is back in The Man with the Red Tattoo. So he's in league with the Union, and he's setting off explosions around the world. We hear some instances of this throughout the story. And ultimately the climax comes down to, there is going to be a bomb set off at the Cannes Film Festival, and it will kill a lot of people in the auditorium, a lot of famous people, including some Bond alumni, which I thought was a really nice touch. Sophie Marceau and Carol Bouquet are in attendance, along with the likes of David Lynch and Francis Ford Coppola, which I really liked. It's a very glitzy, star-studded event, and Bond obviously needs to stop the bomb from going off. But that's ultimately what the villain's kind of, the plot is in this one. And whilst obviously such a terrorist event occurring in real life would be devastating, obviously, I guess I'd kind of built up this expectation in my head that this was going to be a bigger, sort of more global thing. And again, there would be global ramifications of this happening, of this event happening. Goro Yoshida has a whole sort of scheme, which I'll probably end up talking about more in the next book, where I think he plays a bit of a bigger role. But again, like I say, I'm coming into this already knowing that this is the conclusion to a trilogy, and I'm expecting, you know, a plot that's a bit, you know, a devastating event that would be bigger than an auditorium of famous people getting blown up. And when I first realized that that's what the climax was going to be, I'm not going to lie, I did feel somewhat disappointed, and I think I let the next few chapters just kind of wash over me as a result, because I was like, oh, that's what it's come down to in this one? Though, as I say, revisiting the book a couple of months later is probably the best thing I could have done to effectively get over myself, in all honesty, and get over the kind of expectations that I had. And once I came to it with those preconceived notions out of the way, I felt like I could really actually enjoy just how exciting and wonderfully written the whole climax to this story is. So it's weird, because even though the element of surprise wasn't there, I found myself engaging with it so much more on a second read-through. I've talked in the past, you know, I think Raymond Benson writes some of the most incredibly exciting bits of action that I've experienced with Bond on the page, and this whole climax is, if it's not at the top of my sort of Bond, you know, literary action sequences, it's in the conversation. I found the whole thing that's going on in the auditorium incredibly suspenseful and exciting, and again, like I'm saying, I'm feeling the suspense on the second read through, where I obviously know the ultimate outcome, but I felt like I was just engaging with it a lot more. But yeah, the whole thing is just really exciting, like how the news of the fact that there's a bomb, you know, sort of makes its way through the crowd in the auditorium, and then Tylin is there, and Bond has to find where the bomb is, and then he's chasing Essinger, and then they have the whole climax on top of the climax with Bond storming Legerant's base of operations, which, again, I found all really exciting, thrilling stuff. And yes, to talk a little bit more about Legerant himself, I loved him in this story, but over the course of this, just the trilogy of books, I think he has been a phenomenal adversary for Bond. It is another one of those things where, you know, again, sympathy with any writer who has to come up with a unique head of a villainous organization for Bond to go up against, but Legerant is far, far from being a Blofeld clone. I think he has a tremendous presence and a great identity in these stories. He is, like I mentioned earlier on, he's this almost supernatural figure in a lot of ways. He's really quite a unique figure in the pantheon of Bond villains, and a highly memorable one, and there are some great bits in this story in particular. I love him and Bond have a card game at one point, which I loved, and then how he ultimately meets his end is really satisfying. I really enjoyed it. So I think that's everything to talk about in this book, right? No, nothing else? No other elements that I'm sort of fascinated to know how controversial they were in their day? Okay, yeah, so now we are into the big spoiler, at least I think this is kind of the big spoiler. Mark and Draco, Bond's former father-in-law, father to Tracy Bond, is back in this story. Funnily enough, someone had mentioned, I must have read it in a comment on a previous video or something like that, or maybe just through osmosis, you know, reading about, you know, Raymond Benson's work. I knew that Mark Ange was coming back at some point. It caught me off guard in this when he was back in this particular story, though, because I think because Mathis was already back, so I didn't really have the anticipation of another sort of classic character from the Fleming era coming back. But particularly for a story where Bond is falling in love with another woman, I felt like it was, yeah, really appropriate for him to come back. And obviously, you know, Tracy is invoked in memories of her are invoked in places, and he's really a shadow of his former self. He's really like taken it quite, I mean, obviously Tracy died a while ago, and he was remarried and then had a young daughter later on in his life, and they have both passed away also, so he's really this shell of a man, to the point that he is in league with the villains. He's in league with the Union. And it's a very... I mean, that's the big twist of the story, that Mark Ange is actually in league with the villains. And yeah, it makes complete sense. The man is a crime boss. Like, yeah, no, of course. It's funny with these things, because Bond does... You see it in the films as well, with like the likes of Top Hall and stuff, where Bond gets to be in league with these characters, and they're always very, keen on softening how bad they are. Bond might be in league with these people who are up to, illegal stuff, but it's they never cross a level of immorality. Whereas I was very interested in this story. Yes, I mean, there's a lot that has gone on in Draco's personal life that has arguably turned him into this, but he was always still a criminal at the end of the day. I would be fascinated to know, please let me know in the comments section below how this went down when the book was first released, because it is one of those things where it's taking, I say beloved character. I think the beloved aspect of the character is the film version, right? And the performance there. I don't know if that same sort of warmth you necessarily feel on the page in Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but these things are conflated sometimes, so I can imagine that some people were probably like, how could you make Mark Ange a villain, and such a detestable one at that? But it's I say detestable, there is an element, because it turns out that his wife and young child that died were on the film set that Bond destroyed when all the innocent people died at the start of the story. Some of those innocent people were Mark Ange's family. So that gives him enough of a personal reason to be taking an interest in this particular mission involving Bond. I think it does go a little bit... There's also mention made of him and Legerant being... Is it half-brothers or cousins or something? Draco shrugged. The money was better. Besides, blood is thicker than water. Olivier here that's Legerant, is my nephew. His father and I were half-brothers. We shared the same mother, you see. And that was an element that I don't think I particularly needed. I was fine with Draco's kind of motivation for being involved in this whole thing being, the fact that, yes, he is a criminal, but then he is also, reeling from the death of his family that was ultimately because of Bond. And I would have been fine with that being, that's enough for me. I didn't need the extra level of family ties. Personally speaking, I thought it was a fantastic twist, and I really enjoyed, it genuinely caught me off guard. I think because Mathis is here, and Mathis, he's not a villain in this story at all, but because they're classic Fleming characters, right? I never really expected Draco to happen. And then, again, another reason why I'm glad that I read it through a second time is just noticing, oh, okay, yeah, no, it's there. I'd be interested, that's another thing I'd be curious to hear in the comments, if anyone out there kind of, got that on the first read-through, that, oh, well, he's, obviously in league with the villains, because it completely passed me by. And I think I just had it in the image in my head was of, Draco from the film, who's this, warm, classy character. But he's a very different character on the page, particularly in this story. And, I loved it. What can I say? It was a really fun and unexpected twist for me. Never Dream of Dying is another book to throw on the very highly recommended Raymond Benson continuation novel pile. I had a great time with this. And like I say, second time especially, where I felt like I was over some of my preconceived notions about what I was expecting the story to be. Once I kind of got that out of the way, I really enjoyed, the final fifth or so, the whole chapters and the climax. I very much recommend that Bond fans just seek out the whole Union trilogy as well. I wouldn't recommend going to Never Dream of Dying as your very first Raymond Benson story. I would... I would start with either his very first, or indeed High Time to Kill. If you want to experience the Union trilogy itself, then High Time to Kill is, I think, absolutely go for it. So that's it, I'm almost at the end of my Raymond Benson journey now. We'll be back talking about The Man with the Red Tattoo soon enough, and then the Die Another Day novelization is going to be talked about. I'm going to be doing a whole month's worth of videos focusing on Die Another Day, so do stay tuned for more news on that. And there's also like a bunch of Raymond Benson short stories as well that I want to talk about as a collective video. One of them is actually quite crucial to something that is in The Man with the Red Tattoo, so maybe the next video you'll see from me will be talking about those short stories. But as ever, do please let me know your own thoughts on this story in the comments section below. And also below there's the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button to stay up to date on future video uploads. And with all that being said, until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.